This lesson is called Sky Gazing Through the Lens of the Bible, and sort of a survey of questions like, how did the biblical writers see the universe? Everybody, when we think about the universe, we have some conceptions, we have some ideas about it. And there are people who want to tell us what the biblical authors thought and what they said, and we need to be able to go to the source. We need to be able to look in here and find out if what they're saying is true, and not to just take their word for it. This session will examine evidence from God's written word and its early translations to consider which cosmological questions it addresses and how the Bible's perspective relates to ancient Near Eastern viewpoints. So big questions about the cosmos, both about its origin and the extent of it. What were the biblical writers talking about? This is the holy word of God that we are considering. God's Spirit breathed it out. These holy men spake, and they wrote as they were moved by God. And God is a God of truth, a God of faithfulness, a God of all power. He has preserved His word. He has communicated it with the accuracy and the clarity that He wants. Now, He doesn't always give us all the details and all the precision of everything we'd like to know about, and I trust God has given us so much to explore in His world that He wants us to find out. He wants us to search out. He doesn't answer all of the questions for things that He gave us the senses and the mind and ability to figure out, but there are certain things, when He speaks to it, it's there, it's true. Amen. We need to believe it and seek to understand it the best we can. But we also understand the Bible did come about in a time and a place. It came about in through different writers, and there are different cultures, and that's important. And what is the relationship of those? I think that's an area that the waters can be muddied sometimes. And I like to think of in terms of, anybody ever been to a planetarium? Ever been to an observatory? And you look through the telescope, or maybe you have a telescope you've put out in your backyard or in a friend or family member's yard at some point. One of the big concerns when you do that is you want to be able to have a location that's free from light pollution. You don't want to have a whole lot of city lights in view, or you're not going to be able to see the celestial lights. And I think there's an analogy there for us as we start to look through some of these questions, that some of the commentaries, some of the articles, some of the speeches, some of the YouTube videos, some of the books and resources that are put out, whether intentionally or not, sometimes they produce a lot of extra light pollution that gets in the way of us seeing what is truly in God's Word. And so I hope this will help us to be able to orient ourselves away from that, and also to consider what makes for a good guide. Now, I'm not an expert astronomer by any means. I had the privilege to share the stage and take turns, interacting some with some astronomers and people who have really delved deeply into that subject. If I were to go get me a telescope and set it up in the backyard, I would love it. Dr. Danny Faulkner or Dr. Russell Humphreys or somebody could come over and not only have a clear night and a clear view, but tell me what in the world I'm looking at and tell me what I'm looking for, how to use that tool. And so there are people who will help us to understand God's Word, but sometimes we need a little help in navigating the difference in that and some of the light pollution. Two terms that I need to mention here that are kind of used somewhat interchangeably in a lot of these studies, at least when we talk about the biblical writer's view: cosmogony and cosmology. They're both terms whose, according to Odin in a standard reference work, they're both terms whose etymologies or word histories remain helpful in defining them for the purposes of discussing their place in biblical thought. The first element in both words is obviously the same Greek word that lies behind the English cosmos, and thus refers to the entire universe as an organized entity. A cosmogony, cosmos plus genea, birth, is thus an account, usually in the form of a mythological tale about the genesis or birth of the structured universe. A cosmology, cosmos plus logia, a report, is a blueprint or map in the widest sense of the universe as a comprehensible and meaningful place, the locus of almost all cosmological thought in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament is in cosmogonic texts. Hence, the two terms have traditionally been used almost interchangeably in discussions of early Judaism and Christianity, and they will be so used here. Now, I do have to give a caveat when I read this definition and say that the author is absolutely right, that there are many accounts of the cosmos and of origins of the cosmos that are indeed mythological. We do not count the Bible to be among them. The Bible is the true story of the universe and how it came to be, who made it, how he made it, why he made it. The details that we are given, and we're not given every detail about those matters, but the details that we are given are true, and they are trustworthy. And so we need to keep that in perspective, of course. But we realize there are other people who, they have their alternate stories. They have their take on it that they have been promoting in some way, and we'll be considering how that relates to the biblical record. But first, let's consider the Bible and the ancient Near Eastern conception of the universe. I think, I don't know if it was a generation younger than me or who invented the term, but see the quotation marks I have around the article there, what do they call them these days? Scare quotes? That's what this is. This is a set of scare quotes. When I say the ancient Near Eastern conception of the universe, that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek here. And we'll talk about why here in a moment. This is a graphic I found in my Logos Bible software. This is a tool that I and other students of the Bible like to use, and some to greater or lesser degrees. It's a tool that provides library resources digitally across a spectrum. You can find viewpoints just all over the map in this. You can find the author maybe that you would like to learn from. You can learn from somebody else who thinks very differently as well. So I don't think the producers of this software necessarily endorse this, but it's one of the things that you can find in certain of their materials, because there is someone who would argue that, who's published about it. And so there is this idea you will see in some books about a Hebrew conception of the universe, ancient Hebrew conception of the universe. Now this one doesn't come right out and say the, but it's sort of implied here and in other places. And there's this idea of this three-tiered structure of the cosmos with this underworld, and that's where Sheol is, and that the earth is there on top of it, and that there are literal pillars, and that there is this dome, perhaps with this solid firmament there, and then the waters above the firmament, and then the abode of God there. And the idea is that they will say that this is the viewpoint that the biblical authors held, that there's no way they could have had any idea of a spherical earth. There's the conception they have would be contradictory to our modern understanding and ideas. That's the claim that's made. Here's another place that it's made. Have you all ever heard of the Bible Project YouTube videos? Those are very polished. They're very well done. They're enjoyable, and I would dare say that many of them are helpful. I have enjoyed some of them. Perhaps the ones on the epistles would be ones, if I was just to pull one up and just watch it for my edification, I might go to something of Paul's epistles and just kind of see the structure of the letter and some of the things they teach about it. But as with anything, we need to be Bereans. Remember, they were even checking out the Apostle Paul when he came and was preaching to them, and they were searching the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. And we must have that mindset. And I was saddened to see with the Bible Project and their treatment of Genesis and their treatment of origins that they promote this sort of idea that this is the view. And notice, this is from one of their websites. If you want to check me out, make sure I'm telling you right, you can go to that website and see this. They say it might seem strange or even primitive to think of the cosmos in these three tiers, the sky, the land, and the sea. But this was the cosmology of the biblical authors. In other words, they're claiming this is how the writers of the Bible saw the universe. They understood it to be constructed and composed in this way. And that's a very popular source. There are a lot of churches that will use the Bible Project for a Sunday school class or use it for a Bible study, so forth. And I'm not sure that everybody who would facilitate one of those or lead one of those would be aware of this. And it'd be really easy just to swallow. These experts made this. It's polished. It's beautiful. It's it's really catching to the eye and the ear. And so it must be right. Well, you better double check. And here's another source, and this one in some ways troubles me a little more because it's for Bible translators. That's an area of missions that I have a special concern for, as I have had the opportunity, and not just the opportunity, but the privilege and the stewardship of studying the biblical languages. I do not take it lightly. I thank God for the kind support of my church and my theological education, and they've allowed me to take seminary courses. They've allowed me to take some alternative classes to grow in God's Word, to study through. I've not gotten through the whole Old Testament, the whole New Testament, but I've been privileged to go through some of its books in each one, in some ways, in the original languages, and it has been glorious. And I had loved every minute of that, at least after a certain point, after I got over a certain hurdle. But Bible translation is an ongoing mission need that there's not a whole lot of awareness about, because here in America we've got 300 different Bible translations into English. They're not all equal. Some are absolutely horrible. Some are better than others, but there are still languages with no portion of God's Word in their native tongue. Nothing at all. And there are organizations that have helped to try to remedy that, training Bible translators in Hebrew and Greek, and in learning the target languages and thinking of best ways to convey the meaning in those target languages, because the grammar and the way the words are put together, the syntax, they don't always match up exactly. And you have to be kind of creative to get the point across at times. SIL International is an organization that's been involved in that, and they have done some very good work. This is a paper, though, that is connected with them, and this paper is urging that when Bible translators are trained, that they have an awareness that this is the view of the biblical authors, and that this can inform and should inform their translation of passages in certain ways. So this is an idea about the Bible and about the biblical authors that has been spread quite a bit and has taken, I think, a pretty good foothold in a lot of different areas. But I don't think it's accurate. And I'm not necessarily an expert on that topic, but I have discovered one who is, one whom I would recommend if you want to study this further, if you know a student or a scholar who wants to learn the other side, or who is being challenged by this and wants to know where to go. Dr. Noel Weeks was an Australian Bible scholar and historian. He just died this past year. I was hoping to meet him in this life at some point if I'd had the opportunity. I had not heard of him until recently, and I checked with another Hebrew professor whose opinion I value greatly, and he said, yeah, he's good. Check him out. Dr. Bill Barrett told me, this is a good resource for this topic, and he actually engages a lot of people who advance the ideas we were just talking about, the idea that the Hebrew or biblical author's conception of the universe was like that. Here are some points he makes that are relevant. Number one, biblical backgrounds are complex. When we go back into ancient history and we try to say, this is what these people believe, this is what these people believe, this is what these people did, and so forth, we have to understand that we have only a small amount of information with which to work. We have archaeology, we have texts from the archaeology, there are other places we have writings at times as well, but according to different cultures, it's very fragmented at times. And some of the discoveries that we even base our ideas off of have only been found in the last century. But there's a lot of complexity. There are multiple contemporary cultures as well. There are cultures in Mesopotamia. There are cultures to the north of Israel. Ugarit is one they found a lot of amazing writings from. You've got Egypt there to the southwest. And you do have contact with cultures. There's no doubt. I mean, you see that in the first book of the Bible. Look at Abraham's travels. Look at his interactions with other people groups along the way. Look at the narrative of Joseph and when he is sold into slavery. And you know that there are trade routes, and there are people who come into contact with each other. And I think already I've got a professor who's done work on loan words in the Bible, where you will pick up words from other languages. Now, do we have anybody here speak Spanish? No Spanish speakers here? Okay, can I still talk about my amigos? Yeah, I can still talk about my amigos, because we have taken that word right on over, and we use some of their food words and so forth too from that language. We have a lot of that ourselves. I just took a French course, and I was surprised to find how much overlap there was between English and French, and how we have quite a few borrowed words that we have adapted, or just, even the word air. We talk about air all the time, but that comes from the French. It's not an original English word. But we get that because we've had a lot of different cultural contact over the years and centuries. Well, they did in the ancient world as well, and there are multiple cultures. One of the problems we have here, though, with this going back in ancient history, is we don't have anything from Palestine besides the Bible. Now, the Bible, of course, is the supreme source, and that's what we want to go to. But if we want to say that the biblical authors held to such and such a view, and we say that because, well, that was a view that was around in their time, and there were neighbors that had it, so they must have held to the same thing, that ain't necessarily so. I dare say if we were to do an archaeological excavation of St. Louis, Missouri, in the year 2951, if the Lord doesn't come before then, would we find one viewpoint about the world? My, we've got a ton. Just right here where we are physically at the moment, right? Folks around us who think very differently. I mean, maybe even next door. There was a scholar years ago who wrote The Universe Next Door. He wasn't talking about a multiverse or some kind of science fiction idea. He meant your neighbor next door who may have a completely different understanding of the world and God and religion and salvation and so forth. And I think we've got to be careful here. Without evidence from Israel and the nation and the background of the biblical writers themselves, without actual evidence outside the Bible from that, it's really not the best practice to assume that those other cultures, that they have the same mindset. And I think the ancient Near Eastern mindset is a dangerous idea. One of the sources that they will often say reflects what the biblical authors also would have shared is the Enuma Elish. Now, the Enuma Elish is a Babylonian creation account of sorts. Now, it's not entirely clear whether this is actually even being presented as this is the way the universe is, or whether it's just some sort of an origin story to support their religio-political system. But let's take for granted that it is intended to support an idea of how the world came to be. And it's a very violent origin story, by the way. You've got a god being slain, and she is ripped in two, and she is her body's taken to form the upper and lower levels, and so forth. And there's some ancient diagrams that show her just kind of extended over the earth and so forth. But there's evidence that was written well after Moses. Now, the Old Testament and the New Testament give us a lot of reason to believe that Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, that Moses is responsible for Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, I don't think that precludes Joshua writing about Moses' death. I don't think that means that someone so closely connected to Moses wouldn't have, made that update and things like that. But I think overall we have to look at the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, as Mosaic. And I believe Jesus and the apostles looked at it that way. And one thing I teach high school for my full-time job, and I teach Bible, and one thing I try to urge upon those students is as they go to college or as they read other books or come into contact with other views and arguments, that they understand it doesn't matter how many letters the person has behind their name, if their viewpoint disagrees with what Jesus and the apostles said, and of course the prophets as well, but if it disagrees what we clearly see in the Bible and we see what Jesus was saying, you go with Jesus. He knows everything. He created the world. You're not going to go wrong following him, but men will lead you astray if you're not careful. But many scholars, of course, don't accept that the Pentateuch was written by Moses, and they have reasons they argue for. We don't have time to get into all that, but I don't think they're always well-founded reasons. Sometimes they bring up legitimate questions, but there are other explanations. They also, by rejecting Mosaic authorship, they also place the Pentateuch as being fairly late, like around the time of the Babylonian captivity. We're talking about 1,000 years or so later from the time of Moses. But many of us believe, and I think with good reason, in following Jesus and the apostles, that Moses goes with the Pentateuch. And this being the case, there's good evidence that the Enuma Elish was written well after the Pentateuch. So it's hard to say that it influenced it, and it makes it very, for a much weaker case to say that they definitely shared the same ideas. Noel Weeks also points out that when you make this claim that there is the ancient Near Eastern mindset, that they held to this 3-tiered universe, that's something you have to argue and establish. You can't just claim it. You can't just basically make that accusation and expect it to be accepted. There has to be some good substantiation. And I think one of the key points here is the next to last one. When we read this throughout the Bible, and this was one that I believe occurred to me as I first started to hear about these ideas and started to see scholars who said, okay, let's study the ancient Near Eastern backgrounds. And you would find pretty quickly that some scholars would focus on the similarities, some scholars would focus on the differences. And there are some overlapping concerns. I mean, sometimes they will want to say, you know, what is the origin of this? Where did this come from? And you will see some similarities at times, but you will also see differences. But when you read the Bible, what's the overall tenor of the Bible seem to be in the Old Testament when God talks to the people about who He is and His uniqueness and how He wants them to be different from the other nations, and how even as He goes in, as they go in, He doesn't say, you know, go in and take their religious texts and go in and take their viewpoints and go in and learn from them how things came to be. No, learn from my mouth, learn from my instruction, learn from my word, be different from the other nations. And I think that's a key point we need to consider here when we hear people say, oh, they found this text, and you know, it's from the same time period of the Bible, and there's some similarities here, and so they must share the same ideas. Well, not necessarily. I mean, there are these folks that maybe discovered about in St. Louis that they live next door to each other, and they went to the same grocery store or something. They must think just alike. No. They may have some overlap, but they may have some very important differences. And finally, Weeks and another scholar, Davidson, point out that the idea that the Hebrews believed this concept, showed you in the diagram, that did not arise until the early 1800s, that we don't have evidence that that was even taught until the 1800s. Now, we understand that knowledge in certain fields grows and progresses. We understand that, but many of us as believers have a very hard time thinking that we've gotten the Bible completely wrong on certain ideas about the relationship of the biblical authors to the ancient Near East until they finally made certain discoveries in the 1800s and the 1900s and did these digs and those digs, and it kind of impugns the character of God that, you know, he didn't communicate to us clearly enough. We had to get all these archaeological digs, and these people finally helped us to figure it out. That's, I think, problematic, and we need to be careful. So I hope that serves to show the caution that needs to be taken when you hear people claiming that the Bible reflects this viewpoint that obviously is very contradictory to what we see when we look in the world. I don't disbelieve the photographs that are taken from space, that we have a spherical Earth that is here, and that the sun, you know, is far beyond us. It's not in this fixed dome. I don't think the biblical authors would disagree with modern science if they saw what modern science is seeing in those areas. And I've got to be careful when I say modern science. I don't mean all scientific opinions. I mean what we can actually validate, what we can actually continually go back and verify with our senses. God wants us to trust His Word first and foremost, but He does want us to engage with what we can see in His world. So what about the Bible and cosmology? If the Bible doesn't teach this three-tiered universe, what do we do? Well, one tool that we might use is a lexicon. Who's heard of a lexicon? A lexicon is just a fancy word for a dictionary. And lexical, like we'll use that, you know, get in our technical lingo in the biblical scholarship world, you know, we're doing a lexical study, you know, we're doing a word study. We're going to look at this word, basically, is what that would mean. But if you were to buy something for a student and say, you know, here's a Hebrew lexicon, it's usually called that rather than a Hebrew dictionary. What's it for? Well, we look up the meaning of words in dictionaries. Well, actually, what if we find a word that has multiple meanings? We're really looking up a range of possible meanings when we use a dictionary. We are looking at possibilities. Now, there are some words that are pretty narrow, they're pretty specialized, they don't have, you know, 70 different meanings, but there's some words that do. If I were to say, we're going to talk about a scale today. We're going to talk about a scale. Do you know what I'm talking about? We're going to talk about a scale, and some of you might think, we're going to talk about music today. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. We're going to talk about the relative 7-tone scale that we use in Western music. No? Okay, well, what about a scale where we weigh things? And we see you know, kind of how their mass works there and measure the weight. Well, maybe not. We're going to talk about that part of the body of a fish. We're going to talk about the distance, relative distance relationship to something. If I were to show you a little matchbox car, and I might say this is a 1 to, I don't know how big they are, 1 to 64 scale, that, this is 1/64th the size of a real truck that it's representing here. There's a lot of meanings to that word scale, aren't there? And there's more than that. You can use it as a verb. You can scale a mountain. It doesn't mean all of those things in a given usage. I'm not talking about music when I talk about the little truck. I could use it as a word play in some sense. I could talk about putting it on a scale as well, and kind of, we might laugh or something. Sometimes we can use double meanings. Sometimes the Bible uses double meanings. John, I think the Apostle John's a master of that. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not comprehend it. And there are even some words there that word translated comprehend could mean comprehend. Some Bibles translated overtake or overcome. And I think John may be engaging, I don't know for sure, but I think he might be engaging a little bit of wordplay there. And the darkness has not overcome the light. That's true. It didn't defeat it. Can't stop it. It also doesn't comprehend it. It doesn't get it. Can't quite grasp it. The light's greater than the darkness either way. But normally our words, we're not going to use trunk to mean an elephant's snout in the back of a car and a box under the bed and the portion of a tree or a human body. That's ridiculous. Now, if I can pick on preachers for just a minute, because I do preach, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful or an ugly way at all, but some of us have heard sometimes somebody get up behind the pulpit and they'll say, now the Greek word here, or the Hebrew word here means this, and this. Well, at the most, it's probably just this and this, but it's probably just this. It's probably just that one, and you have to look at the context, because we use words in lots of different ways, and that's normal, and that's good, and that's fine. You can see that in Genesis chapter 1. God uses the word day in different senses. I believe he's talking about literal creation days, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But he will also use it as a general period of time. And you just look at the context. And the context helps you see which one is being conveyed there. But a dictionary, a lexicon, we've got to remember this is a study tool that's put together by whom? It's not, Paul didn't say all lexicons are given by inspiration of God and are profitable. He didn't say that. It's Scripture that's given by God, that's inspired. Lexicons are helpful tools. Okay, but tools have limitations to them, and tools sometimes have defects to them. And lexicons are compiled by humans, and in a fallen world, humans err, make mistakes, ergo, therefore lexicons can err. Lexicons can have mistakes in them. And I want to point out that I'm so thankful in our day we have such easy access to things like Bible software that's free. If you've got a smartphone, you can carry your Bible around. I don't recommend replacing your physical Bible with it, but you can supplement having a physical Bible by having this wherever you go. You get stuck a surprise appointment you got to make, or you got to get your car repaired and sit in the waiting room, or the doctor's office, you don't have anything with you. Well, if you've got your Bible on your phone, that's a lot better than the magazines that they might still have there. And you can do some searches and things like that on the computer or the phone that's just like that, and it's amazing. But one of the sad realities about many of the tools, and many of them are free, and I'm glad God's Word, I think it needs to be given out freely. But some of the study tools that go along with it that are free, sometimes they're not always the best. Sometimes they're out of date. The only reason they're included, the only reason that dictionary is with that Bible is because it's free, or it's the best free option they have. So we still got to use good sense when we read, look at the context, how it's used in different passages, and that makes for a little better filter. If we're, think of this as a filter maybe on top of our lens, or our telescope. I'm going to point out a particular word that we see a problem on with the lexicons now. There are a lot of words we could look at about the sky and cosmology and the universe, like Shemaim for the heavens. We could talk about the sun, the moon, the stars, and so forth. But I want to talk about this word rakia, which in a lot of our older Bibles is translated firmament. Some Bibles now have started to translate it as expanse. This app is a picture of the literal word app. Anybody ever heard of that app? It's a free app. It's a good app. It takes the New American Standard Bible and lets you hold down on one of the words, and notice up at the top you can see, actually let me, no, I don't have that one. If I can mouse it over here or not, but anyway, right there beside Genesis 1 to the right, that's where you see a Hebrew letter, and that means you're looking at the Hebrew. So when you hold down that word. You can see where I held down with my finger, expanse. See at the bottom what popped up. You see rakia in the Babylonian script that was later adopted for Hebrew there. And because not everybody's going to use this app reads that, you got it transliterated. You got it basically spelled out in a way we can understand it in English, rakia. And it tells us that it's a noun. It says it found 15 occurrences of it. And then notice it gives us a definition. Here's our dictionary entry. Extended surface. Now notice what's in parentheses. Solid. Expanse. Firmament. And then it says, your two options for translating this. Expanse, flat as base, support. And then two, firmament, a vault of heaven supporting waters above, considered by Hebrews as solid and supporting waters above. Now, do you see this idea that we looked at earlier with those diagrams? You see how it has somehow filtered into this dictionary? This dictionary is from 1906. Now we might think, well, it's fairly recent. That's way after the time of the Bible, too. It's been a lot of time for people to study and investigate things, and there's truth to that. But one of the realities of studying the biblical languages is that while the Bible does not change, and while ancient biblical Hebrew does not change, it's fixed. It's already written. It's done. And modern Hebrew is a reconstruction, a revival. I think it's great. It's helpful. I want to learn it one day. I want to be able to communicate with some people. I want to read some journal articles. But it's not exactly the same as biblical Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew is fixed. Biblical Greek of the New Testament era, we have Greek today. It's still spoken. But biblical Greek is fixed. It doesn't change, but our understanding has changed in certain areas. It has improved. There were places in some of our Bible translations that they didn't have a clue what that word meant. That word occurred one time. Well, what can we do? Well, let's just spell it out like we'd say it in English when we get a new word there. Or they might find out, oh, we thought it was this, but then we realized as these other languages and other discoveries came to light that this is what it is. It's especially difficult for those words that just occur one time. And you can't find any sister languages that have one that seems to be equivalent. We have one in the flood account. What kind of wood was Noah's ark made from? Well, the Hebrew word is gopher. Now, that's not the English gopher. It's not talking about the animal. That's the name of the wood or the tree that the ark was to be constructed from. We have some good guesses. We have cypress in the Targums, which are Jewish translations and paraphrases after the time of Christ. Might have been some kind of cypress or resinous wood. The Septuagint renders it basically as planks or as squared lumber. So it doesn't tell you what kind of wood. It just talks more about the preparation of it. And we don't know for sure what gopher wood was. We just don't know. Maybe one day we will. But rakia, if you think of it this way, that could be problematic, but we'll talk about why in just a minute. But here's some other free tools. And I love these tools, and they are useful, but just use them with advisement here. This is BibleArc.com. It'll let you look up the meaning of a word if you want to study the original text there. And notice you see that same thing, extended surface, solid. StepBible.org, great tool, highly recommend it. You can do some advanced searches that you would have to have paid Bible software to do otherwise. You can take 2 words, 3 words. If you want to look up all the places sun, moon, and stars appear, in the old days you break out Strong's Concordance, you got to look up sun. You got to look up moon. You got to look up stars. Maybe you write down all the references and then you find out where they overlap. You notice the verses that they have in common. But here, you can do that, boom. You get all the results there. But notice its definition, extended surface. And you see that word solid there once again. And here you see the word in different translations. Now, in the second columns, our Masoretic text, our witness to the understanding of the Hebrew text, rakia. On the left, I've got the New King James, which, just like the King James and the translations in its heritage and history before that, used the word firmament. And I was talking to Dr. Faulkner. He was telling me it goes back to Wycliffe, who was the first to translate the entire Bible or have it translated into English. He did it from Latin. Now let's go back a little farther. Let's go to the far right, and you see Latin. But you can see a word that's highlighted. If you don't know Latin, you can probably still see that word looks really close to our word firmament, doesn't it? And that's where Wycliffe likely got this from, by translating from Latin into English, which is better than nothing, but not the pure fountain source of the Hebrew and Greek. Go to the Greek for just a moment. The LXX is a standard abbreviation for the Septuagint, which is an early Greek translation made by Jews in Alexandria, Egypt, around 250 BC. They did the Pentateuch, first 5 books. Later, there were others who added the additional books and even some other writings. But they translated the word rakia as stereoma. And that word has the sense of something that is solid and something that is firm. But the question in thinking about this word is, the idea of solid, is that really there in that word? That word is one that shares a root with a verb. As many times, we have words that are like that. We have a song. It's a noun. We had a song, holy, holy, holy. We sang the song. That's our verb. Or we, before we did, we are going to sing a song. We are singing a song. There's many ways we can talk about it. Well, when you talk about the rakia, there's a verbal form. Now, the Hebrew verbal system, I won't try to, bore you with all the technicalities of it, but there are different ways that you can indicate something by some, slight vowel changes, and sometimes consonants added at the beginning and end, just like we will add ed to the end of a word sometimes, or we will sometimes add a word to help us understand the sense. Like if I say I sang, that's different from I caused her to sing. Or I was sung to by this person. Well, Hebrew has a very efficient way to take it right down through there, and there are different ways you can use the verb form of this word. And sometimes it's stamping something out. Maybe you're kind of flattening out with your feet. Sometimes it's using a tool. Think of a hammer, perhaps a swordsmith or somebody, and he's forging that sword. Bang! Bang! He's flattening it out more. Or, if you were making some kind of a large metal sheet out of raw materials and you're flattening that thing out, the word is used in a sense that has to do with beating out metal. And metal is solid. But the question is the word solid, does that concept necessarily belong with rakia? And do you always have to flatten out or beat out something that's solid? Is it possible that you could stretch out things that aren't solid? And a couple scholars, here's a Jewish scholar, Sarna, he talks about how the basic meaning of rakia is extending. And I'm not necessarily arguing for everything he says here, but just notice the possibilities that he gives here. He says it's unclear whether the vault of heaven was here viewed as a gigantic sheet of metal or as a solid layer of congealed ice. And he references some other passages in another ancient writer, Josephus. But notice he focuses on the basic meaning being extending. The basic meaning doesn't necessarily include the solid or the metal part. Davidson notes that it does not refer to a metallic hemispherical vault, the noun form. And a lot of this, he says, goes back to a mistranslation of that Enuma Elish. And he says it's best translated expanse. And this placement of the greater and lesser light doesn't betray a wholesale acceptance of ancient Near Eastern cosmology. Rather, it seems to provide a polemic or an answer, a counterpoint against major parts of that. And the waters above refer to the atmospheric clouds containing the waters, rather than some kind of solid dome that you got waters outside of that solid dome. And I was really surprised in talking to Dr. Faulkner how much a lot of this plays into the flat earth movement of today. And they will take some of these ideas and really try to apply them to some extremes. And the sun's right up there in that dome, and there's waters that have to be let down through these chimneys and things. And it's just don't think that's what the Bible's teaching here. Matthews is a great commentator. Don't endorse everything in his commentary, but he's very thorough and I think very fair-handed in how he treats ideas. He talks about the expanse as the atmosphere, distinguishing the surface waters of the earth from the atmospheric waters or clouds, and he talks about how rakia may be used for something that's beaten out or spread out like a covering. And the Bible talks about God, spreading out the heavens, like a cloth, like a garment. Now that's not solid in the way metal is solid, right? I mean, there's more stretch to it, you might think more porousness to it. I mean, and it's used in something of a figure of speech there, but I think it should indicate to us that rakia doesn't necessarily mean it was solid, that it was made of metal or something like that. So my concern there is just be careful using those study tools, especially the dated ones. Don't necessarily take them at face value. You still need to look at the whole range, and sometimes on ones like that, you've got to look at some other sources that get some help at times. Because it's just sad, because people they've muddied the waters, they've polluted the light, and it makes it hard for us to see what's really there when that's the case. Let's just take a real quick look at Genesis 1. On the left, I've got the New King James. On the right, I've got the Leningrad Codex, which is our most complete witness to the Hebrew text. When you talk about the Bible, you talk about ancient texts, we have different witnesses for them. And the Bible, we have more than one witness to it, but this is the oldest complete Hebrew Bible. And it's very thorough, and it's the base for our study of it. There are other things we use, Dead Sea Scrolls, but they're not complete. They're, Genesis. I love Genesis. It's where I really want to dig into and study, but it's just a sad reality in scholarship that Genesis is like the book that the kids carried around in his backpack the entire school year, and the cover is falling off, and the first few pages are ripped to shreds. And as the beginning of a scroll, that's how the evidence is, that Genesis doesn't always survive too well in the scrolls, and you get little pieces and parts of it. But so we're talking about 1,000 years, after the time of Christ, that this one is from. And notice the spacing here. I tried to put little circles where new lines start. Do you see that? Some of them even skip down an entire different line. You don't need to know Hebrew to notice that. That's obvious. This is Genesis 1. Anybody want to take a guess at where those spaces occurred? What they separate in Genesis 1? The days of creation. Every day of creation has a new section opening up after it. Now, don't tell me that ancient writers, ancient copyists, didn't know anything, didn't have any kind of literary sensibilities. They had something of, I'm not going to say it's exactly the same thing as our paragraph, but it's something like that. We might call it a sense unit. And there's even a whole field of scholarship that's starting to advance a bit called delimitation criticism. In other words, like, where do you know where to cut off a section? Like, when this is the first part of his sermon, or this is the first part of this person's argument. Where do you know to kind of break that off into chunks? Well, they were doing that in some way, and some of these breaks, now they're not all uniform in all copies of the Bible, but as far as I know, and I've looked at several things that witness to the days of creation, they are in the days of creation. This is pretty firm. And there were even ancient Jewish writings about it. One of the leading rabbis that a lot of Jewish traditions use to inform their copying of the Torah scrolls, and certainly would be related to things like these manuscripts that were meant to preserve the vowels and the way that the scriptures could be chanted and so forth, and the Masoretic tradition, which is why you have all those extra dots. Everything else is consonants. The big letters are consonants. Dots and dashes and things like that are your vowels, but also accents that group the words together. One of the rules about that was if you were copying a Torah scroll and you messed up on that, that's not good. When you do these spacing areas, you want that to be clear, and it could invalidate a Torah scroll, because when they're preparing a scroll for reading in the synagogue, they want to make sure it's right. In fact, the idea of a scribe, sofer, is a word that's related to the word for counting, and they would do just that. In the Masoretic manuscripts we have, you can find places, such as at the end of a book or something, where they will tell you how many words are in that book. They'll tell you what the middle letter is. They'll tell you what the middle word is, and it's an amazing thing. I think if those guys had computers, wouldn't that be awesome what they'd come up with and come out with? But anyway, first day of creation. This paragraph. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim ve'et ha'aretz is how it all begins. And there is a question about that very beginning. I'm going to mention two views that these are not from, one from the true believers and one from the enemies who hate the Bible. No, these are people who love God, love His Word, have a different perspective on it, but who would agree that this is an independent statement. Yes, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and that is, that's what happened. That's where we go to for a beginning, the beginning. There's no other beginning before this for the creation. This is where it all was. Now, I point that out. You may or may not be aware that some people want to translate it differently. They want to say something like, when God began to create, and just leave it just kind of when He did, whenever that was, and maybe there was stuff before that. Maybe there were materials before that. Some people try to bring that in or leave room for that. Don't believe that. And the scholars I'm going to talk about don't believe that either. They believe that there's an absolute beginning. But what does this verse indicate? Is it giving us a summary and maybe a little bit of a preview about what's going to happen? There's many people who believe that, and they've got good reason. It wraps up in verse 1 of chapter 2, thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. So verse 1 maybe tells us what He's going to be doing in the following verses, and verse 1 of chapter 2 tells us He did it. He wrapped it up. Another interpretation is the first event of creation. And what I just showed you with the manuscript spacing, this is a big part of this. That if they group them by the days, it would stand to reason that everything from the first break up is going to be day 1, because the next section's day 2, next section's day 3, and so forth. Also, you can read some ancient interpretations. Now, we've got to be careful. Ancient interpretations are not the same as, now a New Testament interpretation would be inspired. But these others, they're ancient witnesses, and we have to be honest about that. They're not infallible, but they should be considered. And if you were to say it's the first event of creation, I see that in the Bible, say you're crazy. Well, I'm not the only one who saw it this way. There were some ancient people who did too. It's not a new idea. And Dr. Jeremy Lyon, put out a study in 2019, I think, that made a really good argument for it. I'm not going to take a position on it today. I've got a Hebrew mentor, and we've got connections, to others who have different views on it, and I kind of see where they're coming from. I think there's a better case for one or the other, but either way, you do have the heavens being made here in the first week. Okay, we're only talking about a few days. This is not something that pre-existed. It's something God created. Verses 6 through 8 give us the account of the firmament in New King James, but translation expanse is what I would prefer to say based on what we talked about with Rakia. Talks about the separation He makes there and the naming of it as heaven. Then in skipping down to day 4, we see God talking about the lights, dividing the day from the night, signs, seasons, days, years, putting them to be light on the earth, and He does. The great lights, the greater of those to rule the day, the lesser to rule the night, and doesn't name them there, and doesn't give them really glory right there. It focuses on God made this, God created this, and here's why He did, and He made the stars also. Now some people think that's like thrown in like, oh, by the way, He made the stars, but it's grouped with the lesser light. The stars are here to give light and direction of these things by night, and elsewhere, the stars are multitudinous, as He'll say to Abraham. If you can count them, you can count your descendants and so forth. God's the one who gives them all names. It's amazing. But God made these things, and He has a purpose for them to mark the time for us and a regularity. So when we read the Bible, what do we see about the cosmology? It doesn't have necessarily all the details and all the information and all the things that we have seen in later science that we might want to say is right there, but there are some things we can definitely say, and there's, I'm sure, more we could explore as well. But at a basic level, Genesis 1 reminds us absolute beginning, which I think also hints what the Bible will bring up later. There's also going to be an end, and there's going to be a recreation, a new one as well. But the heavens and the earth are God's creations, not eternal, not God's, not to be worshipped. Deuteronomy 4:19 warns about that. Don't worship the sun, moon, stars, and host of heaven. God gave them to serve man. He makes on day 6. And man's going to rule over the animals and so forth. And these things are here for us. God's placed us here. And He's given us these time markers and these periods where we would rest and periods where we work and so forth. And it's His good gift. The heavens and earth are a product of creation that's orderly, God didn't just throw this stuff together. He didn't just put it in a mixing bowl and hope it turned out all right. He had a sequence and order he was using, and there's also a symmetry to it. There's a beauty to it. There's things that he makes these spaces that he later kind of fills them up. And some people try to pit these ideas against each other. They say, well, look at this. This corresponds to this. The days must not be in order. No. He can make this day and know he's going to do some more things with that space that he makes a couple days down the road. I think there's both. There's a sequence and there's a symmetry. And you find this in some biblical texts. You'll find out there's structure sometimes, like it will kind of be like a mirror image in some ways, but it's also narrating things many times in order. Sometimes they'll go back and give us flashbacks, but this gives us a sequence of the days, but also a beautiful symmetry. Originally good, not from a battle. And here's the thing we've got to remember. They're seen in relation to humanity. Humanity is at the center. Now, the Bible's not telling us the earth is at the absolute center of the universe. The Bible doesn't really address that point, but it describes a lot of things from our vantage point. But scientists do too. I don't know any scientists who would refuse to talk about a sunrise or refuse to talk about a sunset, even though they say, now scientifically, it's this or so forth. We speak this way. It gives us material origins and functions. One scholar that would argue for this diagram type thing I showed you earlier thinks it's just here to tell us what God made it for, not necessarily what he made it of or when he made it or to describe the material creation. But how about both? How about God made it? He really did. It was new. It's his product, and he gives us for these functions. And finally, it should lead us to worshiping our great Creator. When we see language about the heavens, we see things about the sky, the sun, moon, and stars. I did a little search here. This is a cool thing in that app, better than the lexicon. You can see where all these things occur. And when you read about the heavens, you see more occurrences about the heavens in the book of Psalms. Now, the book of Psalms is beautiful, wonderful. It's poetry. And sometimes it narrates literal history. Sometimes it gives it much more broader figures of speech. But one thing the Psalms definitely do when they start talking about creation, they're turning our eyes heavenward to worship God. And we should not lose sight of that. And as I wrap up here, what we want to deal with when we talk about these issues of origins and the light pollution that can come in is what's the Bible actually addressing? What's it actually intending to teach us about creation and cosmology? Not what do some scholars say that they believed. When you read the Bible, what is it actually dealing with? And then, what does God want us to discover with our own senses, minds, tools, and collaboration? Because the Bible does not tell us how everything works in the universe that God made. It gives us some details, tells us God made it, He's in charge of it, He designed it, He's got purposes for it, but there's certain things we have to figure out. Many of us have jobs where, I can't go in the Bible and learn exactly how I need to set up my day and accomplish the things I need to accomplish. God's given us the ability to learn these things and to work together and to do that for His glory and realize, the Bible is the ultimate source of truth. It's infallible. We can make mistakes, but God does want us to go out and search out these things He's put here for us in creation for our benefit and for His glory. And I appreciate your time this morning and trust that God will help us to have that mindset.